Old Joe was still lying on the bench when we got dropped off. It looked like he hadn't moved, but I did go close enough to see that he was still breathing, and he was, so I let him be. The two others were talking about heading to the inn. It was falafel night after all, and at the end of a very long week. At the end of a lot of long weeks, in fact. We were all sore and tired and dusty and very glad this harvest season was pretty much done. A warm inn full of people with a fire on and big mugs of wine sounded really good, especially given that we'd been hauling grapes for weeks. Nice to taste a little fruit of the vine after all, you know? It was then the farmer showed up, or the vineyard owner to be precise. He stopped and he called out, and I looked around, but aside from old Joe, we were the only ones there. It was earlier than the usual drop-off time, but not by much, and our vineyard harvest was done for the season, as were we. My friends were already shaking their heads in protest. "Why are you standing around idle all day?" the farmer called out. And my friends shouted back, "Because no one has hired us." And then they burst out laughing as they gathered their dusty things and turned to go. I went over to see what he wanted, mostly to be polite. "You want some work, young fella?" he asked me. "Now? Tonight?" I asked. "I'll pay the day rate if you'll come now." I looked back at my friends who were still shaking their heads, and now they were laughing at me as they began to turn and start the walk toward the village. But he had offered the day rate, and the day was almost over. Well, I decided right then and there that even though the lure of a warm inn and hot food was strong, a day's wage in a couple of hours was stronger. So I nodded, and I turned to follow him. Often, when we hear this Jesus parable of the laborers in the vineyard preached, there is an assumption made, or sometimes several assumptions made, about the workers that the farmer hires. Sometimes it is assumed that they are not great workers, or that they are lazy loiterers, or that there is something wrong with them that makes them unhireable. Maybe they were somehow conniving or pulling a fast one on the farmer and then subsequently on the other workers. But it was harvest time, and it was harvest time for every farm and vineyard in the area. And the Jordan Valley is big, and it is lush, and it is full of olives and date trees and figs and vineyards and on and on and on. There would have been dozens and dozens of farmers needing laborers at that time, and hundreds of men willing to do the work, especially because there were no machines back then. It was all done with humans and with animals. And there was a time urgency, as there is in every harvest too. The food needed to be harvested and then preserved before it went bad and before the season changed. And the text doesn't tell us much about the workers themselves, except that these ones were willing. So what if the point of this parable was not the laborers and their employment status at all? What if these few who were lucky enough to be hired for a second time in a day and paid another day's wage to boot, what if they were like those of us lucky enough to be paid overtime to stay for an extra shift, a double shift at our jobs when there's no one else to work and the work needs to be done? What if the workers and their motivations were actually not the point of this parable? Another common assumption made about this parable is the magnanimous nature of the landowner or the farmer. Some even surmise that the landowner represents God, and that the point of this tale is that God treats everyone exactly the same, no matter what and no matter when, which is definitely great news and one interpretation, and that's worthy. But parables are usually not meant to be nice, sweet little stories that make us feel good, or worse, that make us feel morally superior. Parables have more to them than first we might think. Dr. Amy Jill Levine describes an unfortunate and an unfortunately common style of interpretation that turns the parable into allegory, and that has the landowner representing God, the vineyard as representing Israel, and the first hired workers as being the grumbling Jews. As Dr. Levine says in her book, Short Stories by Jesus, in this interpretation, the first hired Jews are, and I'm quoting here, are among the followers of Jesus who rejected the entry of the Gentiles into their group, especially because those Gentiles had not been tolling under the yoke of the Torah or the law. And so God, the landowner in this instance, dismisses the complaining and then says, according to Matthew, which by the way is thought to be a late addition to the text and probably not original to what Jesus would have said, the last will be first and the first will be last. Making God so dismissive of those who observe the law or the Torah, and treating the last hired as somehow extra special and in fact first, turns the whole thing into an ugly pot of supersessionist soup. Wait, what does supersessionist mean, you might ask? Well, supersessionism, if you were wondering, is a big, fancy, churchy word that refers to a version of what some call Christian replacement theology, in which the New Testament replaces the Old Testament, and that Jesus Christ supersedes the covenant made between God and the Jewish people, the people of Israel. Some mainstream theologians and denominations have rejected this theology, including the United Church of Canada. And if you want to read more about it, if you really want to dig into a church document, there is one that was written in 2003 called Bearing Faithful Witness. And you can read that. In non-supersessionist theology, as in what we talk about in the United Church, the New Testament does not mean better or replacement of the Old, and old does not mean outdated or replaced. It just means that it was written first. This example and several similar interpretations of this parable where the last hired are imagined to be of a different ethnicity or a bit different socioeconomic status than the first hired, all of this kind of interpretation turns the parable into an anti-Jewish allegory that doesn't even make any sense for Jesus, the rabbi, to be telling. So let's just not go there. Jesus was clever and was using parables as a way to teach, and he didn't invent them. Parables were a way of teaching in that time. And parables, as we know, generally have an uncomfortable and sharp nugget built into them, kind of like a rock inside your shoe that you can maybe ignore for a little while, but not for long. Sometimes with this text, the focus is on the apparent generosity of the landowner, and frankly on his odd business practices of paying exactly the same to the workers that were hired at dawn as he does to those he picks up later in the morning and in the early afternoon and then towards the end of the day. One could say that he was actually not very good at big picture thinking or at planning out his workforce requirements, if you really want to get into that thinking. But what if he was not meant to represent God? What if he was not particularly generous? What if he was just a vineyard owner who was running out of time at the end of the harvest season and needed bodies, any bodies, willing to work and get the stinking job done? Maybe he wanted to go to falafel night at the inn. And so to get this harvest over with, he offered the standard daily wage, a flat rate, such a deal. And what if this transaction was not the point of the parable in the first place? So if it's not about ethics or motivations of the workers themselves, if it's not about the grand generosity and apparent deep pockets of the landowner, if the landowner is just a landowner and not God, and if the workers are just workers and don't represent any other factions, then what is Jesus teaching us here? Well, the problem in the story only arises at the very end of the day. And it arises because the workers who had been there from the beginning get their knickers in a twist. Instead of being grateful for a good day's work and receiving the day rate as agreed upon when they started the day, they get into someone else's business and they began to compare. The business transaction that the owner had with each man had not been a problem at all up until that point when someone got into someone else's business. The farmer and the early workers and the farmer and the later in the day workers had agreed at some point in the day, and each was willing to fulfill what had been agreed upon. There was no problem there. It was only when the early morning workers sensed they had missed out, that things got uncomfortable. You can call it first century FOMO, if you like. And it brought about something not so sweet, something not so nice. What if this parable is about how we count and compare, and how we as human beings do that a lot? If God does indeed love us all unconditionally and no matter what and all the time, why then do we spend so much time in that place of feeling as if we've been given a raw deal? In that place of lack or of not enough, in that place of feeling as if someone else has it way better than we do, rather than in a place of gratitude? Why are we obsessed with counting and comparing ourselves even when we are mostly just doing fine? Well, perhaps Jesus is saying that the kingdom of God is less about measuring ourselves against each other and more about paying attention to our own business with God, our own relationship to the holy. Not to say, of course, that we shouldn't be concerned about the welfare and the well-being of others. That is absolutely not what I'm saying here. That is exceedingly important. That is critical even, to work for justice, real justice, especially for those who are marginalized and who don't have a voice. So I'm not suggesting that at all. I am suggesting that Jesus was about real justice, and in this parable, no real injustice had been done, had it? They all got paid, and they were all paid exactly as they had agreed upon in the first place. And friends, justice is a complex thing. And so much of the time there is no quick or simple answer to making things equitable. But what I'm talking about here is that innate human tendency to constantly measure ourselves and what we have, and therefore to measure our very worth and worthiness. And to measure all of that against those Joneses next door and their fancy Lamborghini we keep trying to keep up with. What if we don't need to do that in God's eyes? To use a Byron Katie question, who would we be without that story? That story of measurement, of comparison, of counting. What if in the face of the good fortune of others, we could say, good for you, and actually mean it, without that voice going, how come I didn't get that? How come, whatever. You can fill in the blank. We do this all the time. What if instead of that constant sizing up to see where we fit in, that we seem to do on so many levels in almost every context, what if instead we were content? What if we could be truly content with who we were and with what we had and with what we were actually, what if we could be actually grateful for all of it? What if we spent more time worrying about our own stuff? And by that, I mean our own relationship with God and how well we do at beginning everything we do from a place of love with a capital L, the way Jesus taught us to. What if we did more of that instead? What if Jesus was describing in this parable a world in which we were enough? Maybe that's the sharp nugget. Maybe that is the rock in the shoe of this parable. And maybe life would be more like the kingdom of heaven if we shook this one out and got on with what really mattered. Maybe. May it be so. Amen.